Today I want to talk about military deception in this video, which has been sponsored by my new sponsor, Dashlane. More of that later. Now, military deception is, I would argue, as old as, well, the word military is. Just how organised people have to be for the word military to be appropriate. I don't know, but even on the tiniest of scale, just two men having a punch-up, there's, even at that scale, a level of bluff and feint involved, I think you'll agree. Sun Tzu wrote his famous The Art of War somewhere around 500 BC. We don't know exactly, but in the region of 500 BC. And of course that deals quite a lot with military deception, and Chinese history, unreliable Chinese history, does give us a number of examples of people putting those sort of principles into play. So for instance, the Qi general Sun Pin in 341 BC was tasked with fighting the Wei, his enemies, under their general Pang Chuan. Now, he consulted an advisor, and the advisor said, well, what do we know about them? Yeah, they think they're nails. They think they're so flipping hard. They've been going around telling everyone that they're absolutely nails and they could just slaughter any enemy they choose because they're just so tough. Whereas they've also been telling everyone that we're a load of cowards and wear slip-ons. Thought Sun Pin, the commander. Maybe we can turn this to our advantage, because if they've been telling everyone that they're so hard, then they're probably going to feel it necessary to live up to this reputation and do something quite aggressive. Also, if they really think that we are a load of cowards, they'd be more likely to believe a deception that involves our apparently acting in a cowardly way. So they cooked up a plan. So what was the plan? Well, how about we light loads and loads of fires, so when the advanced scouts come and look upon our camp, they'll see 80,000 fires burning and they'll think, golly, that's a big army. But as their army closes in, every night we'll light fewer and fewer fires. So it's 80,000, it's 50,000, it's down to 30,000. And what will they conclude? They think we're cowards, so they will conclude that we're suffering from mass desertion and that our army is now really embarrassingly and vulnerably depleted. They'll think they outnumber us, and because they're guys who are essentially bullies, they think they're so hard. What does a bully do when he thinks he has the advantage? He goes crashing in there, because if they think they really outnumber us and will beat us really easily, well, that'll just prove how hard they are and what cowards we are, so they'll fall for it. And it seems that they did. Now, the story goes that Pang Chuan led his army into the attack through a narrow gorge at night. This strikes me as not impossible, but unlikely. If you think that you hugely outnumber the enemy, wouldn't you attack just, in the open by day, rather than confine yourself into a tiny gorge in which your greater numbers wouldn't actually give you any advantage? Well, anyway, that's the situation in which the story says he found himself. And there was a tree in this gorge, and next to the tree was a signpost, but he couldn't read the signpost because it was night time. So he asked for a torch to be brought forward, and by the light of that torch he read the words, "Pang Chuan dies beneath this tree." And that, apparently, was the signal for the Qi archers to start shooting. And you can imagine what happens next. Now, do I believe the story? In its entirety, no, I don't. What are the chances that that sign really was written? What are the chances that of all the people reading it just as the archers started shooting, it was the general of the army that was tens of thousands strong? So in its details, I don't entirely believe it. But it does show you that this issue about military deception and how powerful it could be, how effective it could be, was something that people were given a lot of thought to even then. Hannibal, of course, was famously a master of deception, but I do talk quite a lot about Hannibal. I don't know if you're aware, but I'm making a graphic novel called In Search of Hannibal. There's a link in the description. So I'm going to get away from Hannibal for a while and pick a different guy for once. How about Julius Caesar? Now, Julius Caesar in 52 BC had a bit of a fight on his hands. Vercingetorix had put together a huge and impressive coalition of Celtic tribes to rebel against the Roman rule. And Julius Caesar, campaigning, was on one side of the river Allier, but needed to get onto the other side. Now, the Allier was fordable, but wouldn't be fordable until autumn, and he could lose the entire summer's campaigning time. So how does he get across the river? Well, you could think, well, go across a bridge? Yeah, but Vercingetorix had destroyed the bridge. Well, go to the next bridge. Fine. So Julius Caesar then went along the river to the next bridge, but Vercingetorix went along the river, shadowing him the other side, and destroyed that bridge, and this went on and on, bridge after bridge, getting smashed, and every time Vercingetorix shouting at him across the river, "Ah, you sons of silly people, you cannot get across the river!" And you can imagine this was quite vexatious to Julie, but he came up with a ruse. He was at one bridge, which Vercingetorix had just smashed, and he thought to himself, there's a wood there. I quite like that bridge, actually. Though the horizontals have been broken away, the verticals are still in place. I don't think it would take ages to repair that bridge. Okay, I've got 6 legions, and every day hitherto, Vercingetorix, the other side of the river, has been looking across, and he's seen my army. Now, in this period, Roman armies on the march had a very set order, a very set formation for doing it. At the beginning of the Second Punic War, that wasn't the case. They were a bit ragtag back then, but Hannibal had taught them how to march, and there was a very definite look to a Roman army on the march, and Vercingetorix had been looking at that look for some days. So Julius thought, right, what if I take 2 of my legions, hide them in that wood over there overnight, then come tomorrow morning, I get my remaining 4 legions, but I make them form up a little bit thinner, which will look the same from the side, from across the river, it'll look near enough the same, and I break them up into the number of units you would expect in 6 legions, and I then put them and all the baggage into a column, march that along the river, and then I could play a few hands of cribbage while we wait in the woods, and yeah, let's see how this works. So he hid in the woods, played some cribbage, I don't know if he won or not, and then in the morning came out. They've gone. Okay, lads. So he then got the 2 legions to repair the bridge double quick, get across it and form a bridgehead, send a rider along the river to catch up with the column and tell the column, guys, we've built the bridge, quick, turn around and come back. Vercingetorix then looks across the river and goes, oh, there you are, and sees that the Romans have turned tail. But of course there's a certain amount of momentum involved. He then has to try to work out what he's going to do, and the Romans got back to the bridge first, got across, and Vercingetorix was so shocked that he ended up withdrawing all the way to Gergovia. So that's an example where you're fooling the enemy into believing that you have exactly the same number of troops that he thought you did, rather than earlier, which you were trying to fool the enemy into thinking that you had fewer troops. Now, let's fast forward again. This time it's John Churchill. That's quite a plain sounding name actually, but he wasn't so plain a man. And yes, he was an ancestor of that Churchill. This is actually him. He was also the Duke of Marlborough, so a bit of a toff really. And he found himself in command of one of the armies of the Grand Alliance in the War of the Spanish Succession. So it's 1704, he's just popped over from Britain, taken command of the army, and he is tasked with protecting the Netherlands from, amongst others, the French. He is hugely outnumbered. He has about 21,000 men. The nearer of the 2 French armies has 90,000 in it. The situation is this. Way to the east, and a bit to the south, the city of Vienna, capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is being Hungarian Empire is being besieged by a coalition of Bavarians and French. If Vienna falls, that could be the end of the Grand Alliance. So yeah, the stakes are pretty high. And the Duke of Marlborough, John, he came up with, I think you'll agree, something of an ambitious wheeze. He thought, I know, why don't I, in secret, march all the way there and relieve the siege? And that'll keep the alliance together. Thing is, the French up against him, they knew that his Dutch masters wouldn't allow him to do that and just leave the Netherlands vulnerable to their attacks. And because they knew he wouldn't be allowed to do it, they thought that he wouldn't do it. And yes, it was true. They wouldn't allow him to do it. But that didn't mean that he couldn't do it. And if he did do it, it would surprise, well, everyone on both sides. And you can't be betrayed by your own side if they had no idea what you were planning to do. So he told his Dutch masters that he was just going to campaign along the Moselle for a bit, a perfectly logical extension of the campaigning he'd been doing the previous season. So, okay, off you go, they said. And so off he went, and then he went a bit further, and after a while he found himself in a position to threaten Strasbourg. Now, Strasbourg was quite significant because the French had only conquered it not many years before, and Louis, oh, which Louis are we on? I forgot which, Louis that one. There are so many Louis, I can't keep track. King Louis of France was very sensitive about Strasbourg because he didn't want to lose it again. That would be embarrassing. So naturally, the French could be expected to react and try to prevent him from attacking Strasbourg and stop and perhaps ask for orders from higher up. Now, the Duke of Marlborough, he persuaded the governor of Philipsburg to, well, I say persuaded, perhaps forced is a little bit closer to the truth. He got the governor of Philipsburg to organise building a bridge across the river that would threaten Strasbourg and amassing a load of supplies on the near side of the river. Now, the governor of Philipsburg, he wasn't in on the plan. He, if interrogated under extreme duress, would presumably have said, well, it was presumably because he wanted to go across the bridge. Why else would he want me to build a bridge? In fact, the building of the bridge was just a ruse to distract the enemy. And when the bridge was finished, the Duke of Marlborough had a look at it and said, yeah, it's very good, thank you, right. Bye, everyone. And thanks for the supplies. And he headed off east. He had wrong-footed the enemy, and in an extraordinary march, he covered 250 miles in 5 weeks. Now, this was not just a deception. You could say it was also organisation and a huge amount of secrecy, because in order to move his big army right the way across Europe, he had to organise an awful lot of alliances in all the various points of call along the way. He had to say to these people, you're going to be on our side, right? You're not going to side with the enemy. And when we turn up, there's going to be enough fodder for the horses, enough water and food for the men, and we're going to need money, and we're going to need somewhere to stay, and we're going to need safe passage, and we're going to need all these things. He had to organise all these alliances. He had to strike with all these people all along the way. They all had to agree to be in on it in secret. And he pulled it off. Now, how was he able to pull it off? Well, in this period, that sort of thing generally wasn't done. And I think one of the reasons is that people considered it was just about impossible to do. Now, if that's the mindset of the time, if everyone's thinking, okay, it can't be done, no one's going to try that, that's just impossible, then they won't at the same time be making a huge amount of effort to see if anyone's actually trying to achieve any of this, which of course makes it much easier to achieve that if you actually do give it a go. So, through, I don't know, was he using secret codes? We don't unfortunately know all the details because, well, guess what? It was secret. But he was able to organise this astonishing journey right the way across Europe, and then he got into position to fight the Battle of Blenheim, and he beat the Bavarians and stuffed the French, and as a fitting reward, well, is it fitting? He got Blenheim Palace. Now, if you've been to Blenheim Palace, yeah, I know, and just look at, yeah, wow. Okay, I think you will agree it was a pretty big prize, but then, you know, he had done terribly well. And of course, posthumously, he got a tank, a really good tank, named after him, although he didn't know it, of course. So, secrecy and codes and so forth were presumably being used, and this is pertinent because I can now shoehorn in my sponsor's message, because Dashlane, yes, that's Dashlane, okay. Dashlane is a company which specialises in dealing with online passwords. It offers other things too, but they wanted me to talk to you about online passwords. You see, there are problems, aren't there, with online passwords, and I know that I've suffered from them, and I have no reason to believe that you don't too. I mean, how many times have you tried to buy a book, say, online, and just because some git of a YouTuber has recommended it or mentioned it in one of his recent videos, and it's out of print, the price has just skyrocketed. You go click, 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 and skyrocketed? Skyrocketed is what I meant to say. And you go, £638 for a book? And you do a bit more Googling, haha, this shop hasn't obviously got wise to the sudden rise in value of this book, and £8.99, fine, click, give me that book. Oh, I have to go, I see, add to cart, go to checkout. Do you have an account? No, I don't think I do. It needs me to come up with a password. Password. So now obviously you're not supposed to use the same password as you use on other things, because that's terrible for security, and you've got to think in these days of cyber insecurity with all sorts of hackers out there in the World Wide Web, that you go, okay, another password. So you come up with a password and click. And then it says, type it again. No, it doesn't match. You can't see it on the screen because it's all just a load of dots. So you do it again, and then great. Password must include some numbers. So you have to think of a different line from a different movie that includes a number in it. Okay, yeah, I quite like that movie, and I don't think I'll forget that line of dialogue. Okay, so you put that in, the number, you get, then it needs a capital letter. Eventually, if you don't give up and go bald from pulling your hair out in frustration, you buy the book. And you never intend to use that shop again. But by coincidence, 2 years later, you are on that same website, but they've changed their design so you don't recognise it, and you're trying to buy another book. And again, it won't let you do it, so you can click, and what's your email? You put in the email, and then you try to buy it, and you go, no, sorry, that email is already registered. What? You've forgotten that 2 years ago you were on this account, and I'm describing a frustration, and so you then have to remember what your password was, and it was 2 years ago, you have no idea. So, it's for people like us that Dashlane offers its services. There is a free version you can download, and it will remember 50 passwords for you on one device, but there's also what they call a premium account, which will do hundreds of passwords on any number of devices, and is generally a great deal more useful, as you might imagine. Now, if you go to www.dashlane.com/Lindybeige, or you could just click the link in the description, it's much easier. You can go to the site and have a look at what they've got on offer, and this would include, if you use the promo code Lindybeige. It's not exactly secret, that code, is it? I think if people knew that my channel were offering 10% off Dashlane, which it is, they would come up with something a little bit. Never mind. Lindybeige, a nice guessable password there. That's the promo code, and that will give you 10% off their premium services subscription. I'm told that even though it's actually largely to do with security, that's not why people stay with the service. They stay with the service because they find it so flipping convenient, because it fills in all the, yes, fill in. Now, Americans, I don't mind your filling out forms. If that's what you want to do, you can do that. Fair play to you. But in Britain, we fill in forms. A form has little gaps in it, and we fill in the gaps. We fill in forms because we're British. Anyway, if you need to fill in one of these online forms in order to buy a thing or do whatever it is, it does that all automatically. Click and it's done, and it remembers it. And you might think, oh, wait a minute, though, but is it really secure, this Dashlane thing? Because we hear about these companies getting hacked, don't they, and releasing everyone's emails or information publicly, and then it makes the news and everything. Well, there's the thing with Dashlane. Dashlane doesn't know any of your passwords. None of your passwords exists out there on the net. No, your passwords are actually on your physical computer. And with Dashlane, you download onto your computer a program which encrypts the stuff on your computer. So in order to get your password, someone would actually have to physically get your computer and be a hell of a computer whiz to decrypt the doubtless ever so good encryption that Dashlane uses on your physical computer. So it is a great deal more secure. And there's the convenience as well. So there you go. www.dashlane.com/Lindybeige. Now, back to military deception. Let's fast forward now to the American Civil War. So, there was a chap called George McClellan, Major General George McClellan. He also was sometimes called the Little Mac or the Little Napoleon. And he was a Union general who wasn't exactly a great administrator, and very able in his way, but he wasn't exactly renowned for being aggressive and decisive. In fact, Lincoln got really frustrated with him and was saying, what do we have to do to get this guy to actually do anything? And he was relying on a chap called Alan Pinkerton, a Glaswegian who ran the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which was at this point serving as the main part of the Union Army's military intelligence, which was a bit of a shame because it wasn't doing a very good job of it. And one thing it kept doing was massively overestimating the strength of the Confederate forces that the Union had to deal with. But McClellan believed his information, and he refused to attack unless he had 270,000 men. Well, he got a pretty big army. When some advances were made, the guns, for instance, that were supposedly within striking distance, threatening Washington, when they approached them, they found that they were able to sweep aside the Confederate pickets with suspicious ease. And when they actually uncovered the guns, they found that they were just stripped pine logs painted black with a couple of cartwheels stuck on the sides. Ta-da! From a distance, looks a bit like a cannon. One journalist of the time dubbed these Quaker guns. I suppose I should explain that. Just in case you don't know, the Quakers were a Christian, or still are, a Christian sect who are pacifists. Anyway, so there were these Quaker guns. And of course, being Quaker guns, just logs of wood, weren't actually threatening Washington at all. But even so, it was still difficult to get McClellan to advance upon Richmond, which in the grand scheme of things, being the Confederate capital by the way, was really not very far away. Who was between him and Richmond? Well, it was a chap called John Bankhead Magruder. Here he is, John Bankhead Magruder, who was apparently one heck of a showman. I mean, not just on the battlefield, but in life all the time. Apparently he even affected a horse guard's lisp. One story goes that when a load of British visiting officers asked him, how much do American officers earn? He said, oh my, I do not know. I will have to ask my servant. And of course, he had no servants, he had no private income at all. He wasn't a rich man, but he was very good at pretending to be rich, and he got people to pretend to be his servants, and he would throw lavish feasts that he really couldn't afford. But you know, he knew how to create an impression. He was a showman, and he put his showman skills to some use, because he only had 8,000 men and 15 guns to stop the Union army that was bearing down on him, and he had something like 13 miles of front to deal with. Now, 15 guns is nowhere near enough to hold a front of that size. So what did he do? Well, he just guessed where the Union army was likely to come, and then he put out a load of Quaker guns, but he interspersed them with real guns, which was pretty handy, because then occasionally one of them would at least go bang, and if you then moved it and you could make it go bang from somewhere else, it kept up a better impression that these were real guns. And of course, you don't have to have a huge number of bangs to discourage people from sauntering over to have a closer look. So he used Quaker guns, and he had to make out that he was confident. And how did he do this? Well, one thing, he dressed very ostentatiously. He had a very colourfully dressed entourage, and he would ride around in view of the enemy, doing lots of pointing and giving orders to apparently more and more troops about the place. And he got his band to play. He only had one band, but he got to play really loudly in the woods over there at night. And then same band would just, and then played over there. Over there, to make it sound as though there were several bands and a much bigger force opposing the Union. And there was a gap in one of the woods that was clearly visible to the Union troops, and he got one battalion to march across that gap. The guys at the front then circled round, joined the guys at the back, and then they just had one battalion circling for hours. We have letters from some of the lower ranking soldiers complaining about this. I've just been walking around in circles all day. But it just looked from the Union lines as though there was a column of troops, just huge number of Confederate troops. Now, if McClellan had attacked straight away, he could have swatted Magruder aside. His force, the defending force, was utterly inadequate, but the ruse worked. McClellan stopped, reported that he was up against very strong opposition, and the delay enabled the Confederates to bring up loads more reinforcements. So there, that was the opposite of what Sun Pin was doing, that he was making the enemy think that he had more troops than he actually had. Now there's another problem that was faced by another a major general. This one was Pierre Beauregard, and he found himself in command of Corinth, Mississippi, shortly after the Battle of Shiloh. And he, again, was being approached by a very formidable Union force, and he thought, I can't hold this city. If they attack now in force, it'll be a disaster. But he thought that maybe he can do a double deception. He can make it look as though he's increasing his force while actually decreasing it. He was trying to cover a retreat, but he was going to try to cover a retreat with the biggest bluff. He was going to make a retreat look like an attack. Okay, so how could he do that? Well, he sent deserters, that's deserters, to the Union lines with carefully rehearsed stories about, oh, this madman who was so aggressive, who was commanding them, who was just going to keep fighting until everyone was dead. This was ridiculous. I'm joining you lot. This is ridiculous. I don't want to serve under that madman anymore. So this was a show of aggression. He also showed aggression by sending out cavalry raiding parties to spread panic and alarm. They didn't actually achieve anything militarily very useful, but they spread panic and alarm, and that was the main objective. So a show of intended aggression. Then he had a railway that came to Corinth, and now normally you wouldn't put much ceremony to an empty train, would you? You don't cheer an empty train because there's no one on the train to appreciate your cheering it. But if an empty train turns up at Corinth and the platform has bandsmen on it and loads of people cheering and so forth, then anyone witnessing this will assume that the train has got people on it, because why otherwise would you be cheering it? In fact, the trains were empty. He then loaded the trains up with his wounded and then told all the people on the platform, the bandsmen and so forth, yeah, go and find some shade somewhere, have a rest, get something to eat. And then the train, with no ceremony at all, would leave. And then another empty train would come, yay, more cheering, bands and flag waving and so forth. So the Union scouts observing this reported that trainload after trainload of reinforcements were turning up at Corinth, but in fact trainload after trainload of evacuees were leaving. He didn't let his own frontline troops in on what he was doing until quite late in the operation. Fortunately for him, they were quite happy to play along, and they entered into the spirit of the game as well, and they started making straw dummies of themselves and replacing their guns with Quaker guns, and they got drummer boys to stay behind and beat reveille and light loads of fires to make it look as though they were all still there in the front line. And we know it worked. We know it worked because we have letters from the Union commander, who was Major General Pope, to his superiors, stating that he was quite confident that he was going to be attacked in force the following day, which of course he wasn't. And when his troops eventually did go into the town, they found that the evacuation was complete. Not only were there no soldiers left, there were no supplies left. He'd got everything out successfully right under the noses of the enemy. So there you go. Military deception can have huge effects, and they work largely because of the expectations of the enemy. And if you know what is in the mind of your enemy, then you can fool him. And I'll be talking more about this in another video sometime soon. But until then, as always, don't reheat a casserole more than once.